I kept changing the title of this to try and catch all the different themes that I know are very much part of the biosphere and the communities that you're in. And Lucy and I did have a quick chat about things, and we flip-flopped as to who goes first. And I think she's brought out some really good points that hopefully I can perhaps put a bit of flesh on, and we can discuss and sense check in the context of your own lives and what happens here and the objectives of the biosphere. So I'm technical research manager, normally based in Edinburgh. I live down in the Scottish borders, which a long way away from you guys and totally landlocked, but quite a lot of the issues are very similar, in fact. And my title, History, Skills and Sustainability, and really trying to weave together all these different strands with a cognizance of the historic and cultural landscape that Wester Ross is very much part of, and very much in the historic environment and its contributions. So, what can it do for you, and why is it worth thinking about? And I look at it in a slightly revised way, perhaps from formal heritage, which is fine up to a point, but a record of past lives and activities, a repository of local knowledge and solutions. And I think we forget that in an era before ours, when resources were very constrained and expensive, they really had to think about doing things in an intuitive and adaptive way. And we should perhaps take inspiration from that. It's obviously a whole lot of buildings, but it's many other things more than just buildings. It's the crafts, the culture that goes with it, be that song, be that written, or be that physical activities and rituals. Also the materials and their legacy. So we forget that Scotland was a big powerhouse in the extractive industries. Stone from Scotland went literally all over the world, and also half a mile away or 200 yards away. And somehow the collapse of that supply chain is very stark for me, although stone is not the whole story, to be honest. There's many other materials we can talk about. And also, let's not forget the massive investment of capital, emotion and skill that went into all this. So for us to kick it over is losing really quite a lot. And I think in an era of resource strain, where it bodes on us to minimize our consumption of resources, the reuse of what we have is probably a pretty good starting point. And to try and give you a feel for my frame of reference and what we get up to in my team, traditional materials and the circular economy is very much part of our script in terms of contributing to the sustainability of older buildings. You can't keep them going if you haven't got the materials and the people. And even worse, if you do keep them going and you bring in folk from Edinburgh or plasterers from London, I mean, that's just ridiculous and pointless as well. Local skills and trades are just touched on. Climate change adaptation is a huge deal. You'll know more about me than the rain over on the west, but certainly an increase in some areas of 40% on top of baselines from 1960. Energy efficiency and older buildings has probably been my biggest focus since 2010, and we've published a lot on it. The trouble is, any old fool can publish stuff. It needs people to be taught about it, to upskill in it, and get comfortable doing it. And that's really the next stage, which we're ready for that challenge, because that's what needs to happen. EPCs, until about 3 or 4 years ago, I kind of looked on that as a bit of a spottery detail. But in fact, as we all know, it is starting to hit very hard. And there are quite a few considerations with EPCs and how you apply them. It's not an entirely bad story, as I hope I will talk about later. And I like to think that my previous slide and this one links to the biosphere and the UNESCO objectives: conservation, sustainable development and knowledge sharing, and conservation of its natural and cultural heritage. And I think in your area, all these things are quite meshed nice and closely, which I think gives great opportunities to ponder on. A bit of a pitch on older buildings, which again we can characterize depending on your lens, positively or badly. I look on it positively. It's kind of what I do. It's in me. Generally natural materials, organic, compostable. I've picked up on a recent descriptor by the Zero Waste Scotland as defining something that has high sustainability credentials. Adaptable. Don't let listed building business put you off. It's about managing change, not preventing it. Maintaining amenity, sense of place. I call it the legitimacy of established settlements. They're kind of there for a reason. They don't always flood, sometimes. Repairability, and what might be called a burden of maintenance, but a no maintenance product is a product that is unmaintainable. It'll work until the point of failure, and then you start again. And that, I would argue, is not sustainable. Resilience and traditional societies fixed everything. You want to see tractors in Africa, they just go on and on with local solutions. Embodied carbon is quite an important story, and I'm sort of I'm behind the curve in getting to grips with it and articulating the carbon story in terms of resources. Sometimes low toxicity, except for lead paint, so we'll skip that one. Generally local materials, as we've discussed, and I would argue low tech. It's durable and proven. So these are things just to hold in your minds when we're looking at it, and applying some of that thinking, I would argue, can help. In terms of typology of traditional buildings, this is kind of what I have in mind. Whether that's the West Highlands or whether that's the Northeast, it doesn't vary too much, but a fairly standard palette of architecture, and one I would like to think that is still relevant today, maybe with the addition of some bathroom space out the back, possibly. So that's what I have in mind when I talk about a traditional building: the stone, the lime, the slate, the timber, glass, downpipes of zinc or cast, timber doors, windows, bits and pieces, all of which can be upgraded. That's the topic, maybe for a separate discussion, which I'm very happy to have. So that's what it means to me. And just to talk about it all, this is a Category A listed croft house near Braemar that had been empty since 1938. And to back up Lucy's point, the tin roof just needed a coat of paint. Underneath that is a load of thatch, which is kind of interesting in its own way. And the building inside, and it's now finished, has underfloor heating, a ground source heat pump for that, and a few other good features that make it really quite a desirable house now. And next to it, this is the repaired steading, which again is using a standard palette of normal materials, the larch boarding that was touched on, or it may have even, no, that was Douglas fir. And to pick up on Lucy's point, that was milled from, with a miser saw from a stand that was around the cottage at the time. Nicely following existing habits and traditions, blends in quite well, pretty low tech, it all goes together kind of nicely. That is now a plant room and various other bits and pieces. And as you can see, a little bit of mortar repair work. Interesting, the original mortar, which dates from about 1890 on this gable, was mostly, didn't need anything at all apart from a few cracks and bits lower down. So, and then contrast this here with a picture I took a few days ago, a building close to me. I think apart from the glass, I think there's nothing here that has anything in common with the previous buildings we talked about. But what it does have in common with itself is all of these products have traveled hundreds of miles, if not further. Plastic fascias, plastic gutters, plastic edging, fake stone, it's not even real, plastic windows. For me, that's an embodied carbon nightmare, and that won't decay to anything, or if it does, it won't be good to the fish, our rivers, or indeed anything else. So that's the kind of lens I'm looking through some of this stuff. And the money that goes from this, the supply, delivery, installation of this, does not stay near me where this building was built. That goes somewhere else to other people, maybe even in a different country, which is sort of fine, but actually we should be maybe getting the returns to ourselves. Anyway, in terms of the trades then, and the importance of local labour, and I get the story from all over rural Scotland, particularly in the West. It's hard to get people to do things. And then you have this self-fulfilling prophecy of fewer young people able to do the work, therefore they don't do it, therefore you start relying on larger contractors from elsewhere. I would argue greater accountability, money stays in the district, they understand the building stock and the people. You hold back skills and youth flight, you bring in training and qualifications. And I think to pick up on a point about retrofit and the EPC and the housing stock, which no question needs a whole lot of work to bring it up to a good thermal standard and a living standard for that matter, which is a huge opportunity. And that might be the pump priming for aspects to address this. And to some degree, the COVID situation has put a much bigger focus on what is sometimes called the 15, or is it the 15 or the 20-minute district, that you get most of what you need, food, services, and other things from a much shorter radius. Now that can't apply on a sea lock on the West Highlands, I know that, but the principle still applies. And I've got colleagues within HES who look hard at traditional trades training and how that works, how we can deliver more training. And of course, in COVID, we need to think about how that is delivered more closer to the people, be that remotely or through satellite training delivery at local colleges. Whole topic there with potentially a positive story, but not time to flesh it out too much now. Just some local refurbishment work using traditional materials. This is work done about 10 years ago by Stephen Laying, a lime contractor from the east side, Aberdeenshire. And I would argue that if you get the materials right, you get the detailing right to address the weather, you have a very durable and long-lasting material. Looking at this now with my later eyes on it, I would argue that building needs a bit more climate change adaptation, particularly around protection of chimneys and the skew copes of the gables. So nice lime job, guys. 10 out of 10 for that. Maybe 6 out of 10 for climate change adaptation, because I'm not sure how dry those chimneys are now. I can almost guarantee many in the audience will have wet chimneys, wet gables. More of that later. Anyway, materials then, and really picking up on a few elements from Lucy's presentation and analysis. Timber's a good one, and I've got some nice examples, and I think we just need to be a bit more positive and, let us say, might I say, aggressive about its use. In designed work, often with, I'm afraid, architects involved, we get grading of timber problems thrown at us as to why we can't use a certain tree, which is relevant up to a point. We can do aggregates for mortars, plasters, and renders. We can do clay for mortars and plasters. Clay is a really good material, very low carbon. You dig it out of the ground, you mix it with sand, you can build a house with it. It is perfectly good. It's not cheap and it's not a shortcut. It does really good work. And internally as a plaster, it buffers humidity really, really well. So it's something to hold in our minds. I appreciate we're not at the skill level for it, maybe just now, but hold it. And limestone and shell for lime binders. The best lime mortar I've played with came from some burnt seashell products as a byproduct of the shellfish industry. Made the best lime mortar ever, which is possibly why you get some seriously impressive survivals of lime work on the West. Thatch is a harder one for me, to be honest. In an era of increased precipitation, greater relative humidity and shorter wetting and drying cycles, organic materials on a roof don't last as well as they could. And maybe that's one we keep under tin, possibly. We can grow hemp in Scotland for insulation, and a byproduct of that is paint, which I can talk about. Ironwork and fastenings, we can still make locally, even if we don't forge the iron or cast the iron ourselves. All of this is part of the circular economy. And I think perhaps the sad thing for me is we used to do this in Scotland literally until the previous generation, or even later than that. So the loss of economic diversity, of materials, of people is really only recently. And I think maybe the resource crunch is going to help us reverse that. Here's a limestone quarry. This is just south of Oban. We don't think of the West Highlands as being a source of lime for Scotland, and indeed further. The island of Lismore, just off Oban, was a significant producer of limestone for coastal Scotland. And it works a bit like this. You get the rock or the shell, you make a kiln, you heat it up, sometimes using peat or other materials. Preferably don't burn peat now. Get it to the right temperature and you get a mortar. This is part of an experimental project done at Castle Bay a few years ago, using a kiln they built themselves. I quite like all the middle-aged men standing around drinking tea, staring at a fire, which is what I'm starting to do. And you get these shells. So I think this looks like, are they scallop shells possibly? That's just starting the slaking process, where you add the water, and you get a heat reaction, and you mix it with sand, and there you get a mortar. And there's a bit of a story behind that picture, because I was starting off a project in 2016 in Dunbar, doing some boundary works, and Monday morning, cold November morning, of course the mixer didn't arrive. So what do? Well, we just made a batching up tray and got a rake out and batched it there. And that worked really well. And it's a very good way of engaging younger people and trainees with actually the physicality of doing it. And to be honest, it's not much slower, and you almost get a more controllable mortar. That's what it looks like, quite stiff, more like butter or margarine than anything sloppy. And you can use that for building walls. It's pretty robust. We rebuilt a chimney in January 2 years ago with reasonable protection. When you're confident with it, you know what to do. It shouldn't limit you too much, in fact. To pick up on the paint, and this was a pilot we did with the Highland Folk Museum at Newton Moor, where we grew, they grew flax. And this was part really of a project that looked at the songs and the culture around the growing of flax, which really was to make linen for clothes, which until the mid-19th century and cotton imports from the US and India was a big part of Scotland, even urban Scotland. So you grow your flax, you get seeds from it, which is the little clip on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side. You heat it and press it, and you get oil, and you mix that with a pigment, and you get paint, which we've, top right, you can see a window frame we've just painted up there. So a kind of illustration of the circular economy and how it could be applied. I'm not suggesting you all run outside and plant up a field of flax just yet, but as an idea of how one might consider various forms of diversification. The other good thing with flax is, with hemp rather, is you can shred it up and use it for insulation. So a mortar mixed with a hemp shiv, as it's called, will give you an insulated render, an insulated plaster, which we're trialing down at Dunbar just now. So a nice traditional material that can have benefits in the modern era as well. Timber, I don't need to add too much to what Lucy mentioned, but the the rise of the portable saw has made it a lot easier to address timber on site quickly without some of the compliance issues of running a sawmill yourself, which again, until 30 years ago, a lot of land holdings had their own sawmills to rattle up fencing stobs and various basic materials for agricultural or indeed dwelling buildings. And again, the quality control with the right assessment, the right engineering oversight, it's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with timber grown locally. Certain types are no good. Sitka spruce is not perfect. Douglas fir is a good one and seems to grow quite well in Western Scotland. So I'd echo what Lucy said, and I suppose that's about clients being firm about it. I want to use local timber. How do you make it happen? Just to give a quick illustration where we've tried to apply some of these local principles. This is a building just back from the high street in Dunbar, down in East Lothian. It's missing a roof, quite a lot of a wall, and a whole lot besides. And myself, a stonemason, 2 apprentices and a joiner turned this into a building in less than a year, using most of the principles and approaches that we've been discussing. And there was one drawing, which was the roof structure to show building control what we're up to. So you can do this simply and easily and have the confidence to do that. There's a whole industry out there that tells you that construction work is difficult, expensive, and if you talk about old buildings, that's even more difficult and expensive. I would suggest it's perhaps the other way around. So where do you start? Well, start at the bottom, match up the materials and work your way up, which this is the inside to show you the extent of the loss. So we dug out the trees and taken away the compost and 50 years of broken bottles and dead washing machines. And that's what we kind of started with some fairly simple bits of stone, quite a lot of lime mortar, local sand, local timber, which was done at a sawmill, just these joists there, bricks that we picked up and salvaged. You can quite quickly get most things patched up without too much bother. And again, this timber was sawn locally to our own specification and design. And at this stage, we're now just about to put the beam fill in behind the joist there. And rest of the roof is now on. So that's what it looks like from the other side. That's the chimney that we redid. Gosh, it was a year past 2 Januaries ago. And a whole lot of scrounged and salvaged elements you can see going in. That's what it looks like now. Original window repaired, 2 new ones copied up with cedar, as it happens, from the local sawmill. They just had it in and it seemed good. The lime wash was made with, spookily enough, quicklime and water. Although quicklime and seawater is a very good lime wash. It's just got a bit, cures better. And we added some tallow, some linseed oil for weather protection to make it a bit more waterproof. And most of the west of Scotland would have had this type of treatment, give or take. And it's really good. It buffers humidity nicely, allows the building to lose moisture when it needs to, etc., etc. So that's nearly finished. We're not quite there yet, but there's a longer story there that I can dwell on if we have time. And the adaptation script, again, conscious of your time and things, but much more rain. We're getting a lot more runoff from agriculture and forestry due to culverts and all sorts of things. We've got a mixture of poor repair and incompatible materials that quite often try and address the symptoms and not the causes. So an oil-based paint on a wet wall will not really necessarily help you if the water's coming from the top. I would argue that if you have the right materials, you'll have a healthy building. If you have a healthy building, you'll have a healthy person. And it is accepted that change and adjustment is needed to buildings. And listed building consent is okay with that. it's about the management of change. And I've done a fair bit of work on it with an adaptation guide. If you can think of that cottage picture that I showed you before, and a load of details and adjustments, mainly to the outside, that you might want to do to allow your building to shed water better, because we're getting more of it. Don't feel you have to read this slide now, but that just gives a contrast of a kind of happy gable end versus a less happy one. In general, no one factor is in the ascendant. It's generally a combination of things. I think there's a lot of water runoff from other people or other roads and blocked culverts and things. That means you get flooded sometimes, even though you may sit on the side of a hill, as we saw with the farmsteading flooding, as well as the building specific details itself. And if I can get you to think about one thing today, think about the chimney, because generally the wet gable starts at the top. If you don't get that right, it's downhill all the way, not forgetting potential saturation from below. All of this is good basic stuff, but you need the right approach. So some bedtime reading for you, which I've shown on this slide here. And then rattling through then EPCs, and you can tell Lucy and I have been chatting. Generally EPCs, as they are delivered in volume to older buildings, aren't terribly favourable or good. And there's plenty of reasons for that. Many owners have spent 10K plus on a cottage refurbishment, and they go from G to F, which doesn't really help anybody. There are a couple of factors with the certificate and how it's prepared. A lot of it depends on how much time you spend. If you spend £50 or less on an EPC, you're not getting much of that assessor's time. They'll be reverting to defaults unless you can show them what you've done. SAP, which is the calculation methodology behind the EPC, also thinks in quite simple chunks. So if your insulation is under 100 mil, it generally won't see it. If you have 150 mil, it'll credit you with 100. If you have 200 mil, it'll give you 200. So there are thresholds of thickness that it's worth understanding how, almost before you specify the material, because otherwise you may get the thermal benefit, your house will be warmer, of course it will, but the SAP engine won't count it. So there's a few areas of detail in the methodology that the assessor needs to understand and put in, and also they require these elements to be evidenced. So if you just say, well, they put it in, that's not enough. They need to see evidence of that. They need to see the material and maybe even a photograph or some sort of certification on it. But it can be done. So 2 years ago, we completed a category B listed lodge in Edinburgh, built in 1858, in quite a sensitive location with all the world looking down on us. In a few weeks, I hope to achieve a band C. And the reason in the delay is that I had secondary electric heating, and the EPC really does not like secondary heating of any type. So if you have electric heating, even though it was a radiant panel, which was lovely, the folk in the building thought it was great. I loved it. It was secondary heating and it was electric, so I got a black mark for that. Specifically 6 SAP points I lost. And also for those in rural areas, the EPC does not credit wood burners. So a lot of your heating will be with various forms of logs or chips or other biomass. And if it's a wood burning stove specifically in your front room, the EPC won't give you credit for that. In fact, it might even hammer you for it. But again, as part of some reading, case study 31 on that link there talks about this project and how we achieved the band C. An awful lot of wood fiber board and other interventions, double glazed units and various bits and pieces which brought it up. I do know that in rural areas, the heating methodology will be the biggest driver of your EPC, and that's, I think, still a little bit to go in resolving that. But technically, on the insulation side, to echo Lucy's points, if you have the right approach, the right materials, you can get some good results. And it may be that we have a second session on that topic specifically, with some much more detailed information. That's what the lodge looks like. One of those gingerbread cottages, all slopes and roofs and things. So geometrically, a bit of a pain really, but we got there in the end. And in terms of training, we are developing an accredited level 3 award on energy refurbishment in older buildings. It's a fairly short course, but it gets you started in the right direction, and it's part of the compliance with PAS 2035 for installers in older buildings. So I'm hoping by late spring we'll have this course, probably online, maybe based in Stirling for those who can travel, or even looking at federating the delivery of this maybe through college networks and courses in the various areas of Scotland, west or wherever it needs to be. So hopefully on the training and skills side, we can look at something that's tailored to older buildings. And just to finish really, and to support the marine side, the sea should be the lifeblood of the region, and certainly it was one of the reasons for its huge influence in the past. And the condition of piers and harbours, their physical condition, is something I've been involved with for some time now, and I've sponsored a couple of repair projects. It's a key enabler. If you have a couple of local fishing boats that need to land and berth, you need a pier, and if that pier is an old one, it's going to need some work at some point. How is that carried forward? Is it a community asset? Is it local authority, or is it private? Lots of things to think about there. And to support the wooden boat building side, I'm guilty of owning 2 wooden boats myself. I can do roofs and other bits and pieces, basic stuff. But I think there is a hook there for creating the link of activity, place, culture, history, and opportunities for visitors and indeed local people to engage with what was the main highway in the past, and I think offers huge opportunities for recreation and tourism. And the point is that it links buildings and craft and industry and tradition and the culture of the area. And I think Hess in the past have been guilty of the maritime things, being a bit, oh, does it move? Is it in a museum? It's not a building. Oh, right, well. And I think if people had historic assets or traditional buildings with some sort of maritime stroke craft industry link, I wouldn't be shy of coming forward to say, how can you help us with capital or something on that, because the focus of grants is changing slightly to more better economic alignment with what people are doing in various parts of Scotland. So going forward then, and just sort of wrapping up really from the PowerPoint side, Hess and Wester Ross, what about energy efficiency training? We can work on that within this forum. We can talk about traditional building repairs and all the story there. And to reassure you, it is not difficult. It just needs a bit of thought, the right materials and the right approach. So don't feel anyone is excluded from that. In those buildings I showed you in Dunbar, the best line worker by a long way was a 45-year-old person who'd had a history of various addictions and time in prison and a number of other things that limited his outcomes. And he got stuck in from day one with that batching trough that I showed you, and does some really nice work now that I don't think anyone else can better, particularly in the pointing and traditional finishes side of it. I'm sure that Hess can look at assistance in progressing buildings, boats and skills project that have some sort of built environment link. So maybe that's a shed in which someone wants to do it or something like that. If you don't ask, you don't get. And I'm certainly very interested in developing links with businesses or farms or communities on demo work with the circular economy. A few folk have mentioned, oh yeah, this burning shells business to get some lime. Oh, that could be interesting. I know it makes good lime because I used it myself from that burn that you saw. So there's a little bit of a story there. Again, really starting small and just building up confidence and capacity in it. I think that's probably me having droned on for far too long. And probably what's really important is that we have a dialogue and folk can ask things and question things, challenge, whatever.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Roger.